going, children? Is he gonna be all right, Mama? We are almost there, Papa. Stay with us.
The Wyoming winter of 1874 was a relentless siege of ice and howling wind that crushed the spirit from even the most resilient frontier families, huddled in their drafty and long-forgotten cabins. Abigail Crane, a widowed mother of 2 small children, had been scraping a meager existence from the frozen ground of their failing homestead ever since her husband perished in a silver mine cave-in 2 autumns before. Little Thomas, age 7, and his sister, 5-year-old Eliza, had known only the aching belly of persistent hunger and the cold that seeped through the chinking of their one-room shack like a merciless and invisible specter of perpetual winter despair. The cupboard held nothing but a handful of dried beans and a single jar of withered peaches, and the woodpile was dangerously low as the blizzard descended with a fury that threatened to bury them all in a white and silent grave. Abigail wrapped her children in every scrap of threadbare blanket she possessed and prayed with a desperate, trembling faith for a miracle that her exhausted mind could no longer imagine or even dare to truly hope for in her secret and heavy heart. She sent Thomas and Eliza to gather fallen branches from the edge of the pine forest, and they were gone only 10 minutes before they came screaming back, their voices high and shrill with terror and an urgent, breathless excitement that startled her from her weary days. Their tiny frozen fingers pointed wildly toward the creek bed, where a man lay half buried in a drift, his expensive black wool coat crusted with ice, and his face as pale and still as a marble statue carved by a master sculptor's cold and indifferent hand. Abigail could see from his tailored clothes and the heavy gold watch chain glinting at his waistcoat that this was no ordinary trapper or drifting cowhand, but a wealthy and obviously powerful man from some distant prosperous city far beyond these harsh and unforgiving mountains. Without hesitation, she grabbed a rope and a torn piece of canvas, and together, the 3 of them struggled for nearly an hour, dragging the unconscious stranger inch by agonizing inch toward the faint and flickering light of their humble and impoverished cabin. They laid him on her own straw mattress beside the fire, and she stripped off his frozen garments with the gentle, efficient hands of a woman who had once nursed her dying husband through the terrible night of his final and painful hours upon this earth. His breathing was so shallow that she could barely detect the faint rise of his broad, muscular chest, and she knew that without immediate warmth and nourishment, this mysterious and unfortunate man would be dead before the first pale light of dawn ever kissed the frozen and indifferent peaks. She sacrificed the last of their meager supply of precious sugar and a single precious tin of condensed milk, mixing it with hot water to make a thin, sweet gruel that she dribbled slowly between his blue and cracked lips with a patient and trembling prayer. Thomas and Eliza huddled together under a pile of quilts, their wide eyes watching the stranger who had come from the storm like a character from the fairy tales their mother used to whisper to them in the long and hungry evenings of the past few desolate and empty months. For 3 days and 3 nights, Abigail refused to leave his side, bathing his fevered brow with melted snow and speaking softly to him even though he was lost in a deep and wandering delirium that conjured names of distant cities and forgotten business deals from his restless and tormented lips. On the 4th morning, his eyes finally fluttered open, and they were the color of winter steel, sharp and piercing and filled with a fierce and immediate confusion as he tried to sit up and demand where in the blasted wilderness he had been brought against his will and without his consent. His name, he rasped through a throat as raw as sandpaper, was Elias Blackwood, and he owned the largest silver mine in the entire Colorado Territory, a fact he delivered with the barking authority of a man accustomed to having his every command obeyed without question or any hint of hesitation. Abigail simply handed him a cup of warm broth, introduced herself with a quiet and unassuming dignity that completely ignored his bluster, and informed him that his mind was worth very little to a man who had nearly frozen to death in a humble widow's creek bed without a soul to claim his body. Elias was utterly stunned into silence by her gentle rebuke, and for the first time in his 41 privileged and powerful years, he had absolutely no clever retort, no biting command, and no way to intimidate the calm and fearless woman who had saved his ungrateful and arrogant life without expecting a single penny in reward. He watched her throughout the following days as he slowly regained his strength, seeing how she divided the last of the beans equally among her children while pretending she had already eaten, a lie that tore at something deep and long frozen within his chest. Thomas shyly showed Elias the wooden horse his father had carved before the cave-in, and Eliza brought him a smooth, pretty stone she had found by the creek, a tiny offering of comfort to the gruff and weary stranger who had invaded their already crowded and chilly little home. Elias, who had dined with governors and negotiated million-dollar contracts, found himself utterly undone by the innocent generosity of two ragged children who had nothing of material value but gave everything they possessed with a cheerful and unconditional spirit that he had never before encountered in the entire cynical course of his calculating and self-centered life. Abigail asked nothing of him, not his story, not his wealth, not even a promise that he would repay her for the food and firewood she had sacrificed. And her quiet, unassuming nature was a profound and unsettling mystery that kept him awake late into the cold and whispering nights. He began to notice the delicate curve of her throat when she bent over the hearth, the patient way she braided Eliza's hair with ribbons made from old scraps, and the fierce and tender love that radiated from every exhausted pore of her being like a quiet and unquenchable flame. After a week, Elias was strong enough to stand, and he immediately surveyed the dilapidated cabin, the leaking roof, the broken corral, and the single starving milk cow that stood shivering in the wind like a skeleton draped in a hide that was too large and too heavy for its fragile and trembling frame. Without asking permission, he found a rusty hammer, climbed onto the roof in the biting wind, and spent the entire day patching the holes with shakes he split from a fallen cedar, his expensive city trousers ruined by pine pitch, and his pride dissolved into a strange and unfamiliar humility. Abigail stood below, her hands shielding her eyes from the glare of the snow, and for the first time since her husband's burial, she felt a flicker of something that felt terrifyingly and exhilaratingly like hope kindling deep within the ashes of her long dormant and grieving heart. Elias worked like a common laborer for the next fortnight, chopping firewood, mending the corral, and quietly purchasing a new milk cow, a sack of flour, and a bolt of warm woolen cloth from the distant trading post without ever mentioning the cost or expecting any thanks in return for his silent and persistent generosity. He began to read stories to Thomas and Eliza each evening, using the grand theatrical voice of a man who had once commanded crowded boardrooms, and the children would fall asleep against his broad shoulders, their faces peaceful and trusting, and utterly oblivious to the vast fortune that resided in his distant, forgotten bank vaults. One night, after the children were dreaming, Abigail turned to him with tears glistening in her exhausted eyes and asked him why a wealthy mining magnate would waste his precious time mending the fences of a destitute widow who had nothing to offer him but a cold hearth and a broken spirit. Elias took her work-roughened hands in his own and told her, with a raw and trembling honesty he had never before permitted himself to reveal, that he was the one who was destitute, a man drowning in gold but starving for the love and the goodness that she and her children had poured into his empty and aching soul without any calculation or any hope of recompense. He confessed that he had been robbed on the trail not just by bandits, but by his own lifelong greed, and that lying half dead in a snowdrift had been the greatest mercy of his entire existence, because it had delivered him into the arms of the only truly wealthy and generous people he had ever been blessed to know. Abigail wept, great shuddering tears that released years of loneliness and terror, and she admitted that she had been praying for a sign that God had not abandoned her, and that Elias Blackwood, with his grumpy morning scowl and his secret talent for carving little wooden toys, was the most unexpected and most precious answer to that desperate prayer she could have ever possibly imagined. He asked her to marry him not because he pitied her, but because he had fallen hopelessly and irrevocably in love with the woman who gave her last biscuit to a dying stranger, and because he wanted to spend every remaining sunrise of his life proving to her that she was the treasure beyond all price in a world of fool's gold and empty and deceptive promises. They were married in the same small cabin where she had nursed him back from the brink of the grave, with Thomas and Eliza standing as the witnesses and the preacher riding through the melting snowdrifts to pronounce them man and wife before a crackling fire and a God who had smiled upon their improbable and holy union. Elias used a portion of his vast fortune not to build a mansion in some distant city, but to transform their crumbling homestead into the finest cattle ranch in the entire territory, with a sprawling new house, a proper schoolroom for the children, and a barn filled with the finest breeding stock that money could purchase west of the Missouri River. Abigail, who had once counted beans and prayed for a single crust of bread, now presided over a dining table that welcomed weary travelers, displaced widows and hungry orphans, because she had sworn never to forget the bitter taste of poverty and the sweet taste of an unexpected and life-saving kindness from a stranger who had become her soul's eternal and devoted companion. Elias taught Thomas to ride and to manage the ledgers, and he taught Eliza to play the piano he had freighted over the mountains at great expense. But the greatest lesson he imparted to both children was that a person's true worth is never measured by the weight of their purse, but by the generosity of their heart and the courage of their love in times of desperate and overwhelming trial. The story of the poor widow who saved the dying rich mountain man spread across the frontier like a prairie fire, and it became a beloved legend that cowboys told around their campfires, a testament to the truth that Providence often hides our greatest blessings in the most terrifying and seemingly impossible circumstances that we can ever possibly imagine or endure. In the years that followed, Abigail gave birth to 2 more children, a boy and a girl, and the sprawling ranch echoed with laughter and the thunder of healthy horses and the sound of Elias reading Shakespeare to his growing and adoring brood in the long, golden, and peaceful evenings of their abundantly blessed and totally transformed existence. Elias never forgot the feel of the frozen snow that had nearly claimed his life, and he considered every single day since his rescue to be a precious and undeserved gift, a second chance that he would spend every remaining breath striving to be worthy of in the eyes of his gentle and beloved wife and his grateful and devoted children. Abigail, for her part, would sometimes wake in the night and reach for her husband's hand, grounding herself in the miraculous reality that the half-dead stranger she had dragged through the blizzard had become the very heartbeat of her entire world and the living, breathing proof that love can bloom in the most barren and frozen of human landscapes if only we have the courage to offer our last biscuit to a soul in need. So, if you ever feel that your own life is a howling blizzard with no shelter in sight, remember Abigail Crane and her 2 ragged children, who risked everything to save a man they did not know, and in doing so, found the key that unlocked a kingdom of joy, prosperity, and a love that would outlast the mountains themselves and echo through the generations of their blessed and flourishing descendants until the end of recorded time. Subscribe to Western Tailies Official right now and become part of our beloved community, so you will never miss another soul-stirring story of widows, mountain men, and the miraculous love that transforms the most desperate circumstances into the most beautiful and enduring legends of the untamed and glorious American frontier. Tell me in the comments below if you have ever witnessed a small kindness that changed the entire course of a life, and whether you believe that the richest people are truly those who have the most gold or those who have the most love to give in the quiet and unassuming moments of their everyday and often unseen existence. Like this video with all the warmth of a hearth fire on a blizzard night if you believe that a single act of selfless compassion can rewrite a destiny, and share this tale with someone who needs to be reminded that their greatest miracle might be lying just ahead. half buried in the snowdrift, waiting for the hand of mercy to pull them into the light of an eternal and transformative love.